Somebody lost a ticket. Okay. Well, again, welcome here, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kathleen Galvin, who's a professor here in the Department of Anthropology. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Galvin a few years ago when she led or co-led a trip to Africa to introduce administrators and researchers from CSU to the work she had known and loved, and to really develop some collaborative ties with her people that she had known for many years and developed in her research projects. Kathy did her bachelor's degree and master's degree at Colorado State University, and she has been the director of the Natural Resource Ecology Lab here at CSU, assistant director of the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. And as I mentioned, she's a professor in anthropology. She has a very large number of accomplishments over her career. She's conducted interdisciplinary social ecological systems research in the savannas of East Africa for over 30 years and addresses issues of land use change, conservation, climate variability, diet, nutrition of African pastoralists, and other very important topics in anthropology. She's the director of the Africa Center at Colorado State University, and if those of you who have not heard of the Africa Center should take a look at the website. It's a very exciting and dynamic group that has the mission of providing a forum for university research on African sustainability. She's a co-author of several books, more than 100 book chapters, manuscripts, and reports, and the recipient of many awards, including the John N. Stern Distinguished Professor Award and in the College of Liberal Arts, and the 2017 award for Resident Distinguished Ecologist in the graduate degree program in ecology. So without further ado, we're really excited to welcome Kathy here to talk about her work and her perspectives on women in science.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Sue, for inviting me here. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to talk about the kind of research that I've done in East Africa for quite some time, several decades now, and the theme is, oops, don't move your computer, and there are a couple of themes that go throughout this talk. One is from the local to the global. The other one is engaging with increasing diversity as my career has moved through time. So I'll just start. So I'm first going to talk about early work that I've done, humans and ecosystems, followed by increasingly relatively recent work on biodiversity and human well-being, and then local to global issues. And so this is the part of the world where I work. We don't have a pointer, do we? Oh yes, wait.
Make sure it's turned on the side. Yep. Okay, great.
Okay, thank you. So I work in East Africa, and this is the, can you hear me if I, this is the Great Rift Valley. This is the Eastern Rift, this is the Western Rift, and I've worked up and down the Eastern Rift all the way from Tanzania into Ethiopia, but I'm going to concentrate some of the work that I've done in Kenya. And I don't know if some of you may have heard that the Somali Rift is now separating from, there's a huge rift in Kenya. If you've seen it in the news, where there's just like a giant, couple kilometer long, maybe 50 millimeter wide gap in the Rift Valley. And so it'll take a few 100,000 years before it actually disappears off this end of and hits into the Arabian Peninsula, but it's beginning to do that. So I'm going to talk about specific places. First, I'll talk about Turkana in northern Kenya, and then some of our more recent work in Kajiado, but we've also spent a lot of time in Tanzania and in Ethiopia as well. So I was part of a large interdisciplinary project where ecologists and anthropologists were working together in the field. And I have to say that it was a rather unique project for the time. It was funded by the National Science Foundation that funded both anthropologists and ecologists, and that's very rare. But we were looking at how people who lived in northern Kenya cope behaviorally and biologically in a highly seasonal environment. What were the effects on the ecosystem? And we worked together. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the modeling efforts that emerged out of some of our research. So this is the part of northern Kenya, the Turkana, northwest Kenya. It's very highly seasonal. It's got about 10 months of dry season, 2 months of rain. And rain falls anywhere between 150 to maybe 250 millimeters. You can't really do agriculture in this area. And this is 17 days difference. So this is the end of the dry season and 17 days later when it started, after the rains had started, and it greens up tremendously. There's a little green on the acacia trees here, but otherwise it's absolutely bare. And then you get these grasses and shrubs getting green. And people who live in this area have multiple species of livestock: camels, cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys. And each of them have species-specific needs in terms of water and forage, and so they are able to exploit a real mix of output, mostly milk, but meat and blood as well, from these animals throughout the year. And so I was trained as a biological anthropologist, and I was doing diet intake and nutritional status with these folks. And here's a quote in Turkana: "Ejoka kanyamit akaro nakanayakimu," which means, "Hello, I am hungry, give me food." And this could be the theme of this first part of this talk, in the sense that we have a population that was chronically undernourished. And so we were an interdisciplinary group of people. This was funded over 10 years by the National Science Foundation. 17 anthropology students and ecology students got their PhDs from this research. And we lived in tents, were mobile, and moved around with people who herded these livestock. And, you know, when we weren't stuck in dry riverbeds, we lived in tents, and we moved with the people that we were working with. And this is some of the group of people, and this is sitting in the shade doing time motion studies with kids out with the camels. So I spent about 18 months in the field. And I was working alongside an ecologist, a colleague and friend of mine, Lane Kopic, and he was doing bite counts on camels while I was doing diet intake and nutritional status with people. And I always thought I had the better deal because I could talk to people, and he thought he had the better deal because he didn't have to talk to people. So here are quickly, I just want to run through some results of this work. So I followed people from various age sex groups through time, through 4 seasons, over a year, and measured diet intake with the same set of individuals each season. And what you see here, it tells a little story, is that there's not a lot of seasonal not a lot of change in diet, in energy intake in a single age sex group. The only one that actually showed a significant difference was the 14 to 21-year-olds, and those were the boys. Otherwise, what people were doing in this highly seasonal environment with extreme climate variability is being able to actually maintain a flow of foods through these 5 species of livestock into the household through time, which was really quite remarkable. However, and I'll show you in a minute, intake was low. So most of the foods were milk. Milk dominated in the May and June is the one wet season. It dominated all of the diet. About 85% of the diet was don't touch the cord, was milk. And then we have other products, meat and blood, and some wild foods. The grains were the only foods that were brought in that were actually purchased, and they were primarily consumed at the end of the dry season when pastoral foods were no longer available. The consequence of this is that nutritional status was low, really low for these people. Height for age Z-score is a measure of long-term nutritional status. And what you see is among these are the seasons, and then each of these represent boys and girls of different ages. And they're all around anywhere from 0.5 to almost beyond -2 standard deviations below the norm, which suggests that these people are chronically undernourished through time. And the only time that you ever sort of get out of that is when you're an adult. The other measure of short-term nutritional status was weight for height Z-scores or body mass index scores, which is a short-term measure. And again, we just see these measures of these people that were chronically undernourished through time, regardless of your age sex group. So we did a lot of synthesis work after this. We've published several books. We did an energy flow analysis, which in those days, people did. I don't think anybody does this kind of work anymore, partly because it is so time-consuming. We had many graduate students actually quantify the flow of energy from the sun to plants, to animals, to human foods, from all sources. And it ends up that on average, these people, human food was 1.95 gigajoules, which is about 1,300 calories on average. So what's happened in the last 20 years after that in East Africa? Again, this was in the late 1980s. There have been tremendous changes. We've seen changes in species composition. In animals, now we have increasing numbers of sheep and goats and less cattle, partly associated with climate change. But increasingly, these dry, arid savannas are being put into agriculture. But you cannot, in most areas, agriculture is very unreliable, and I've had students look at the effects of agriculture, and in many of these areas, they're getting one crop every 4 years. You have increasing urbanization of the rural lands with small towns sprouting up, increasing wildlife conflict in some places. Believe it or not, even though most wildlife species are greatly decreasing, in some places they're increasing, and so you have increasing conflict. We have things like Christianity, modernization coming in, radically changing people's worldviews, and then you have extreme seasonality from more frequent droughts to actually more frequent flooding associated with extreme events. So we have lots of changes that are changing these rangeland systems. And what that means in terms of people and wildlife and livestock who live in these areas is that once these formerly intact places become fragmented, you actually have to increase your inputs in order for people, wildlife, and livestock to get to the basically the ecosystem services that they need in order to live, and that's primarily different forages and water. And so this is becoming much more of a problem as these places fragment. So what happens is that you have the dry season where there was water and animals and people and wildlife congregate around water in the dry season. They move out in the wet season. We're talking about having all of these animals migrate out. And so during increasing droughts, they move further. They'll go much, much further. But once we start having towns and villages and churches and schools, it's much more difficult to move through that landscape. And there's some places where wildlife do not actually go into these places anymore at all. And then the future is very uncertain, associated with increasing climate change and land use intensification. So we've looked at this fragmentation across the world and see some commonalities that are occurring in many of these dryland savannas in many places. So I'm going to give you one example of sort of drilling down, looking at another place in southern Kenya. Here's, if you know southern Kenya, here's Amboseli National Park. Right on the other side of the border in Tanzania is Mount Kilimanjaro. And there's Kili. And apparently this year they've had bigger snows, greater snows on Mount Kilimanjaro than they've seen in the last 20 years. So, and Amboseli is flooded this year. So another set of extreme events occurring right now as we are drying up here in the West. So we have, again, people, wildlife, and livestock who live in this area. And what one of my graduate students did was look at household surveys. She looked at how people were coping with these changes in these places. And I just want to point out a couple things here. These are household assets and these are income flows. And the assets are primarily in livestock. This is tropical livestock units, primarily in livestock, but people increasingly have agricultural land. But if you look at the income flows, it's still primarily livestock, and agriculture makes almost no contribution to income. And these are just wealth categories among people in this region. It's about 100 households here. And yet, when we look at their nutritional status, lots of changes. People are trying new things, doing business in towns and doing agriculture and everything. Again, height for age Z-scores are still low. And this is 20 years after starting work in this area. This is one time, however, so we have different age groups, and we're still talking about 0.5 or 1.5 standard deviations below the norm. And the same with weight for height and BMI scores as well, very low. So what is happening? People are trying to eke out a living in increasingly fragmented landscapes under increasing climate change, lots of changes, including population changes, and it's actually, they're not benefiting. We often think about when people actually move towards a more like Western diet and move towards increasing participation in market economies, that nutrition changes, and it's called the nutritional transition, and it's not occurring, at least not yet, in these populations. And then finally here, we looked at some old data from 1931 and 1989, and we compared our data, we couldn't do any statistics because we didn't have the actual data, but just the results of the data. And it looks like things haven't changed. They might even be worse today than they were a long time ago. So one of the things that we've done, I work with ecologists at the ecology lab here, is to try and scale up and out and ask questions about scenarios, what if kinds of things based on our data. And so we've developed a household model of pastoralists, and it's unique in the sense pastoralists move through the landscape, so it's spatially explicit. And we've linked it to ecological models to look at a series of questions. And so we've asked lots of questions, including, veterinary care, population growth, but I'm just going to show you just one example of some of the scenarios that we've looked at, land tenure changes and subdivision. So this is still Kajiado, where I showed you that map, and we've put people and their livestock on the landscape, spatially explicit, putting in households. Here's Amboseli National Park in the middle, and here's the Chulu Hills, which is traditionally used as a dry season range, and when people go to when the rest of the world is, when all of this is drying up. And here's Tanzania, and here's Mount Kilimanjaro here. And so we asked the question, what if the Chulu Hills were actually excised from being able to be used by people, partly because it's a little higher in elevation, and so they think they could do some agriculture up there. And just a very simple simulation shows time, and what it shows is the livestock units, the number of livestock. Well, this is based in biomass. That can be supported. So 1983 was a drought year, and 1993 was a drought year. And what happens is it just shows that the Chulu Hills are important for a place for refuge for livestock and wildlife during the times following drought. And if that becomes no longer available, then people get sort of being between a rock and a hard place. Getting to part two, one of the things that's increasingly happening with this increasing fragmentation of these large-scale landscapes is that there's increasing conflict with wildlife. So you have people moving their livestock through these landscapes, trying to deal with drought and floods, and so are the wildlife. But you have increasing numbers of roads and population and towns and all this. So we're looking now at what are the trade-offs with conservation and human well-being. And there's a very famous conservation biologist, Georgina Mace, who put together this kind of list of the way that people in science have changed their views towards conservation, and particularly wildlife conservation. In the old days, it was, nature for itself. And there was no talk about people, and then nature despite people, and we're talking about extinctions and habitat loss. And then increasingly in this decade, or the last decade, it's been about ecosystem approach, trying to expand the scale of understanding the interactions with these wildlife populations and their needs. And now we talk about conservation in relation to people. And sometimes it's conservation and people, but sometimes it's conservation without people. But regardless, when you're dealing with these wildlife populations, people are involved. Even if you have a national park, it's just like in our Yellowstone here, not all the wildlife stays in Yellowstone National Park, and they go beyond the borders. Well, they do all over Africa as well. So even if you have a national park, unless it's fenced, which does not occur in East Africa, primarily it's Southern Africa where they fence their national parks, you're dealing with people in one way or the other. So we have been looking at community-based conservation as it's been promoted as solutions to large-scale changes that are occurring in these savannas. They're supposed to enhance human livelihoods and conserve biodiversity at the same time. The idea is to get income from both, from development initiatives as well as the wildlife. They occur on parcels of private land and pastoral land and trying to re-aggregate these landscapes. And sometimes they're public-private, most often, sometimes private. But the outcomes haven't been well measured. But we're trying to do that, so we did a systematic review, and I won't go into this, but we whittled it down from thousands of articles to 73 and 65 cases throughout of southern sub-Saharan Africa. And we were really interested in just the ecological outcomes and the social outcomes and the conditions that actually are said theoretically to improve outcomes of community-based conservation. And I just want to point out that community-based conservation, it never sits alone. It sits in relation to things that are going on locally, regionally, even globally. For instance, in northern Kenya, there's a consortium of over 36 conservancies, mostly funded by USAID and the Nature Conservancy. So these global players are important in order for things locally to occur. So just some of the spatial things that we found out is that most of the literature, the peer-reviewed literature, are looking at social outcomes and not ecological outcomes. And I think in part that's because ecologists don't work in places where there's people. They think they're not pristine enough. Most of the methods used were qualitative and not quantitative, which makes it really interesting trying to do a systematic review. And most of them were sort of public-public partnerships, government and public land. And so these are some of the characteristics of conservancies all over Africa. And here we have goals, which are really quite varied, the activities, which are also varied, in local livelihoods. So one of the things we found out, we looked at all social outcomes and looked at these kind of capitals, and I won't go into explaining each of them. They all have multiple components of them. But what it really says is the distribution of benefits had a very negative effect on the outcome of whether a conservancy was considered successful or not. And if you look at ecological outcomes, they were in large part quite successful. And there were only 14 of them, though. In terms of relationships, components has to do with species richness in these places. So, interesting. Yeah. So what we find is that less than half of the community-based institutions produce positive outcomes. Most focus on social outcomes using qualitative methods. Ecological outcomes were largely positive. But the important thing, one of the really important things I think we learned was this: monetary and non-monetary incentives are necessary but not sufficient for positive outcomes. And we often think if we throw enough money at it, you give people economic incentives for protecting biodiversity, that there'll be a positive outcome, and it's not the case. Devolution of rights to the local community was significantly associated with positive outcomes. So we find that this institution that's growing all across the continent, success was pretty rare. They're not seen as a panacea, even though people like to talk sometimes about community-based conservation as the only way to the future, dealing with fragmentation of these ecosystems. But they're very dynamic, and they're very place-based in the sense that you really need to look at them in place, because not only is government, but policy and culture and worldviews very different from one country to another. And we also need to monitor and evaluate conditions, and we need a better theory of community-based conservation, and we need lots of cross-scale analyses as well. So the last thing I want to look at is increasing local to global scale. So I've given you some examples. I've worked from the very local, collecting diet intake on individuals, and spent a lot of my career looking at local kinds of things. But we really need to, we've done a little modeling to scale up across landscapes, but the question is, how do you connect with what's going on the ground with some of these global scale issues like the Sustainable Development Goals or the IPCC and the IIPBEST? And so I'll tell you about some of the initiatives that we're doing. So some of the partnering, the networking, the SDGs, and the IIPBEST, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So we were funded by the CRISP program here that was actually housed here at CSU. And we brought pastoralists from all over Kenya, Garissa, Kajiado, Kenya, or Narok, and Turkana. These are all very different ethnic groups. They don't normally talk to one another, and we brought them to look to address issues of environmental change and how they viewed that and how it was affecting their livelihoods and what to do about it. So we spent 2 years on the ground doing workshops and focus groups and bringing people together. And one of the things I want to say here, without going through any of this pretty much, is that people were able to evaluate what was going on. These are pastoralists on the ground, from not only local to global drivers of change. And so these, even though they're some of the poorest of the poor on the planet, they understand these drivers that are affecting their system that are highly sophisticated. And again, from the local to the global, and some of the interactions in terms of these changes. So it was a very sophisticated understanding of these forces that are affecting or that are changing their world. And then they also decided what needed to be done. Improving resilience of pastoralism or transform pastoralism. And there were many different things like reduce fragmentation, modify settlement migration patterns to expand women's roles, which is actually quite profound in these kinds of systems where men own the livestock, they own all of the means of production, and yet increasingly women are getting involved in trying to solve some of these problems. Another initiative that we had, we're bringing pastoralists here to CSU. This was funded by the International Social Science Council. Bringing pastoralists here from Mongolia, Kenya, and the US West. We had ranchers here from our own backyard to talk about common research that needed to be done in all of their dry land systems. And we kept a sacred space, so people from Kenya brought their stools. Some local people brought cowboy boots, and when there's a little horse there from Mongolia, but we had this space where the Mongolians and the Kenyans had never met each other before, and so we needed this to develop a place where people could feel vulnerable and be able to really talk about what their needs were, what their problems were, and everybody got to lead this group. We had a series of facilitators from Stanford that were brilliant in the sense that none of us academics who actually paid for this were seen as the leaders. Everybody got to play a role. And we all developed together a research agenda that was based on climate change and the kinds of things that needed to be done. Now I want to go up to the 30,000 foot level and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I don't know if, for those of you who have looked at these, they're very human-centric in improving human welfare across the planet, including, no poverty, increasing education, reduced inequalities, very human-oriented kinds of things. And I'm just going to focus on one, and that's hunger, because I've been dealing for 30 years with people who are chronically hungry. So this is the goal. It says, end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable ag. And so the target 2.1 is you end hunger, you assure access by all people, particularly the poor and people in vulnerable situations, including infants, to safe nutrition and sufficient food. And the way you do it is you increase investment through international cooperation, you correct and prevent trade restrictions, and you ensure the proper functioning of food commodity markets. That would require changing the world. And so we have these lofty goals, and yet we see what's happening in places where people are needing some sort of, not even needing, but they need to be empowered in order to better their own livelihoods as the world changes. So my real interest now is trying to link these global kind of initiatives with what's going on the ground. So you all remember the COP21, the agreement in Paris in December of 2015. And in there, they mention Indigenous peoples and local peoples 17 times, which is better than the one before, which did it like 4 times. So this is just one of the quotes from it. It says, it recognizes the need to strengthen knowledge, technology, practices, and efforts of local communities and Indigenous peoples related to addressing and responding to climate change, and it establishes a platform for the exchange of experiences and sharing of best practices on mitigation and adaptation in a holistic and integrated manner. That sounds great. These people who understand what's going on the ground, in their places, you bring them to the table in Paris. Didn't happen. The week before that, the UNESCO, right down the street from where the Congress was, there was a conference on, it was called The Resilience in a Time of Uncertainty, Indigenous Peoples and Climate Change. There were 650 Indigenous people there, including a couple of us non-Indigenous, but scientists. And they said, we understand, we know what's happening in our places. And I think I have tried to demonstrate that. And people do know what's going on in their places. And they actually have ideas for solutions. And they said, we want to be part of the solution. Bring us into the IPCC. And that happened the week before the IPCC occurred. They weren't there, pretty much. But the idea is that it'll get a little better. So now we have the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I'm a lead author in this global assessment, and it's really looking at the state of biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's got lots of social scientists on this, 120 scientists in this group here. Large numbers, maybe 25% are social scientists. This is unheard of in these global assessments. And they're trying to do it differently than the IPCC. And this is, so we're very interested in 3 things. And this, the IIPBEST is the next iteration of the Millennium ecosystem assessment, the MEA, in 2005. So we talk about it as scientists, we talk about nature in terms of biodiversity and ecosystems. We talk about nature's benefits to people through ecosystem goods and services, and then quality of life through human well-being. What they want to bring into this process is other ways of knowing and understanding these processes, the way people think about nature, like through Mother Earth or systems of life, or nature's gifts, or living in harmony with nature. So they're really trying to bring in other ways of knowing other than mainstream science. So we met in Cape Town in the fall, before it ran out of water. And so what we're doing in chapter 3 is these Aichi targets are mostly environmental targets, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which I've just talked about. And so the idea in this chapter is assess progress towards meeting the major international objectives related to biodiversity and ecosystem services in relation to the Aichi targets and the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're looking at 3 things. What are the opportunities and obstacles to achieving targets? Are nature and nature's benefits to people contributing to the achievements of the targets? And our basic data are showing us is that you'll never achieve those SDGs without taking into account and paying attention to biodiversity and ecosystem services, because human well-being is absolutely directly dependent on those ecosystem services. And then, to what extent does global level biodiversity and ecosystem services rely on indigenous and local knowledge and local communities? So again, bringing in other ways of knowing into it's at the point now where people are going, it's all hands on deck. We have to bring in all kinds of knowledge systems, not just science. So we need to think about changing our mental models about science, and I was actually trained in this model, and that is you get your research funded, you do your research, there might be some development or application out there, and then there's some societal benefits. And it's a very linear model. Somehow you're going to publish in your peer review journals, and you'll get promoted, and somehow it's going to help society. And this engagement model with the pure scientist goes for, the mainstream view is recognition of excellence by peers. You do the best science. I mean, we're all trying to do the best science. You either do it disciplinary or multidisciplinary, but maybe not interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. You might have some broader impacts, hopefully you do, but peer-reviewed journals are really important, and you're seen as the expert. I would like to suggest another model, and this is a transdisciplinary kind of model where you're actually developing a common vision with not only the research community, but maybe parts of wider society or business or future funding policy. You bring as many people, depending on your question. You develop a vision, you integrate available knowledge. And I would put knowledges there, not just science. You implement and you learn. And so this requires co-designing, co-production, and co-dissemination. It's a different way of thinking about how to do science. And I think that my experience has taught me that a lot of people in places have a great deal of knowledge to contribute to the kind of solutions that we're all addressing here. So this is just a really nice diagram of different ways of bringing together different knowledges. And down here are diverse knowledge systems like local, indigenous, practitioners, traditional, transdisciplinary, social science, natural science, I can't even read that one, technical knowledge. And you bring these groups depending on your your question together to try and solve these problems. So with that, I will end. Thank you.